Hello there, I'm Aiden, and welcome to A Pastor's Life for Me. So today we're going to be doing an overview / summary of the book of Genesis. In our past couple of videos, we've looked at two of these books of the Bible overviews, and now we're going to move on to one of our own. My purpose in doing this is to more so speak of the themes of the books and how we see them. I don't plan on doing like a quick run through of everything that happens in the books, but who knows, we'll see as we go week to week. But let's just get started. Genesis is the first book of the Bible, and in English it's known as Genesis, which originates from the Latin. It's probably important right now to point out that our English names for certain books of the Bible do not line up with the original or the Hebrew Greek names for each book of the Bible. Sometimes they line up, sometimes they don't. The Hebrew name for Genesis is Bereshit. They get this because it's the first word used in the book, and it means in the beginning. The Greek name of the book in the Septuagint is NRK, which also means in the beginning, and is the first two words of the book. Our title Genesis does coincide with this well, since Genesis means the origin or the formation of something. Both the Hebrew name and the English name point to the beginning of the universe as it was created by God. Genesis is also known as the first of the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, the Pentateuch, and/or the Law. It's also probably appropriate now to say that Moses is considered to be the author of this book. And it was written somewhere in the range of 1450 to 1400 BC. What Bible blueprints and Bible overviews say concerning that date, the author, the date range, are all pretty accurate. Theme of the book. Now it's important whenever that we're reading through a book of the Bible to ask, what are the themes of this book? Essentially, we're asking why the book was written. Every book of the Bible was written for a purpose. There was a reason why it was penned. So it's important for us to have an understanding of what the purpose of each book is, or the themes. So what are the themes of Genesis? Well, the major one is the Abrahamic covenant. This book traces the Abrahamic covenant from its beginning in Genesis 12 and God adding to it over the next several chapters, it being passed on to Isaac and then to Jacob, and then passed on to the nation of Israel through Judah and Ephraim. But there's more to the book than just that. I would argue that the purpose of Genesis is to trace the history of God's people from creation until what they would eventually become known as Israel. As you'll see when we break the book down into sections, Genesis keeps directing your eye back to a specific line, a specific genealogy that traces from Adam to Israel. So the purpose of the book is to trace the origin of Israel and God's promises to them, specifically speaking, the Abrahamic covenant. So let's separate the book into sections. A common way that some people will break this book up is into 2 major sections, chapters 1 through 11 and chapters 12 through 50. From there, they'll break chapters 12 through 50 into its own subsections. However, I quite strongly disagree with breaking up the book into these 2 sections. As I stated in the purpose of this book, and as you'll see when we go into the way I divide this book into sections, all of Genesis is about tracing that line that would eventually become Israel. To separate the book into these 2 sections puts a divide in the book as if chapters 1 through 11 aren't part of Genesis' purpose. That's often how the book is taken when divided into these 2 sections like that. As if Genesis 1 through 11 has its own purpose and then 12 through 50 has a different purpose. But that's just wrong. In fact, there are 2 genealogies given through chapters 1 through 11 that trace the line from Adam to Abraham, which clearly adds to my point. Now, Bible Blueprints breaks up the book into 6 sections, based off of the life of people. This does make some logical sense and isn't necessarily a bad way of doing it, but I have a different way of breaking it up that you may have never heard of. And I will say that this isn't something that I just came up with. You could divide Genesis into 10 sections and an introduction. There is a repeated phrase in the book that is used 10 times. Ele Toledot. These are the generations of. The specific phrase like this is only used 3 other times in the Bible, all in different books. Each time this phrase is used in Genesis, it is changing the focus from one thing to another. Therefore, this phrase naturally breaks up the book into different sections. Now, the first time this phrase is used isn't until chapter 2, which is why I said 10 sections and an introduction. The introduction is chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 3, which speaks of the creation of the universe and all that is in it. It speaks of the 7 days. Section 1. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth. It begins in 2:4 and goes all the way to 6:9. Using this phrase, Ela Toledot, as a section break also helps with explaining the reason why the book repeats its creation story. The introduction gives us an overview of creation, while chapter 2 goes into the details of the creation of Adam and Eve. They are the first generation of the heavens and the earth, hence the title. This section covers their creation, their fall, and their descendants up until the time of Noah. Now, the end of chapter 5 and the beginning of chapter 6 begins by speaking of the days when Noah was alive, but doesn't really go into details into his life. It speaks of the corruption of the world in his day. But once the book wants to dive into Noah, we see our phrase again. Section 2. These are the generations of Noah. Chapter 6:10 to 9:28. And this section covers the life of Noah, the flood, and his life after the flood. Section 3. These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. 10:1 to 11:9. This section begins with a genealogy and then goes into the story of the Tower of Babel. In essence, this section gives an overview of everybody who had been born from those who came out of the ark. Basically, all the people of the world. And now remember, I said that the theme of this book is tracing the line from Adam to Israel along with the Abrahamic covenant. Therefore, we should expect the book to draw our eyes back to a particular line and continue the story. This is the case because we see our phrase again. Section 4. These are the generations of Shem. 11:10 to 26. This section just gives a direct genealogy from Shem unto Terah, who is Abraham's father. Now remember, back in chapter 10, it already talked about the clans and the families that already descended from Shem, a broad overview of his people. But now the text is drawing our eyes specifically back to the line of Abraham. So though this section is short, it serves an important purpose, to introduce us to Terah, the father of Abraham. Section 5. These are the generations of Terah. 11:27 to 25:11. Now we hit a long section. 14 chapters. Again, continuing the theme of tracing the line to the Abrahamic covenant and to Israel. So the important points of this section: the Abrahamic covenant is cut between God and Abraham. This section talks about the covenant and God's promises to Abraham, that he would have a great name and he would be great, that he would be for a great nation, that his offspring would be like the stars of the heavens and the sand of the sea, that he would possess a land, the promised seed or offspring, that is Jesus, and that through Abraham all the nations of the world will be blessed. This section also speaks of Abraham's life and the lives of his 2 sons, Isaac and Ishmael. It speaks of the death of Sarah, it speaks of Isaac and his wife Rebekah, and it finishes with the death of Abraham. Section 6. These are the generations of Ishmael. 25:12 to 18. Again, another short section, but also important. Though the line is not continued through Ishmael, but through Isaac, God still promised that he would bless Ishmael and make him great too. This genealogy is here to show that. But the section is short because the focus of the book lies with Isaac and not Ishmael. Section 7. These are the generations of Isaac. 25:19 to 35:29. Now that Abraham has died, the story continues through his son. We see the birth of Jacob and Esau and the tension between the two. We also see that the promises of the Abrahamic covenant are directly passed on to Isaac, with basically the same language being used. We see Jacob stealing the blessing, then fleeing to the land where Laban is, where he meets Rachel. Through some chicanery, Jacob ends up marrying Leah, and then later marries Rachel. We see that Jacob is prosperous from God, which then makes Laban prosperous as well. Eventually, Jacob flees from Laban and decides to go back home, where he encounters Esau. Esau has forgiven his brother, but Jacob is still scared of him. And of course, we see the Abrahamic covenant passed on to Jacob, and Jacob's name changed to Israel. Then the section ends with the deaths of Rachel and then Isaac. Since Isaac has now died, can you guess what happens? Section 8. These are the generations of Esau, that is Edom. Chapter 36, verses 1 through 8. This section speaks about the wives that Esau took, and a little bit about some of his children. The point of this section is to tell us that Jacob and Esau went into different lands to dwell because they had both become so great that they could not live together. So Esau settled in the hill country of Seir and founded Edom. Section 9. These are the generations of Esau, the father of the Edomites, in the hill country of Seir. 36:9 to 37:1. Now you might be asking yourselves, didn't we just do Esau? Why are we doing him again? That is a good question, and one that people actually debate when breaking up the book into these sections. Some will combine these two into one section since they're both talking about Esau. I would actually disagree with that though, because there is a distinction between the two. The first focuses on Edom and how the nation came to be. The second focuses on the actual people born from Esau, his genealogy. The first section focuses on Esau's life, the second on his generations for many years to come. The first is about Esau himself, the second about his people. That is why I would keep these separate, and it does feel more unnatural to combine the sections if we're using the phrase ele toledot to divide the book into sections. Finally, section 10. These are the generations of Jacob, 37:2 to 50:26, or the end of the book. Now that the book has taken the time to show how God blessed Esau and how a nation was formed out of him, it again draws our attention back to the line of Abraham and Israel. The section begins by talking about how Jacob loved his son Joseph more than all of his brothers. Jacob is sold as a slave into Egypt by his brothers and goes on to serve Potiphar. He's thrown into prison because Potiphar's wife lies. There, after some time, he ends up interpreting the dreams of two prisoners. Years later, he goes on to interpret Pharaoh's dream and become the second in command over all of Egypt. The prophecies about the 7 years of famine come to pass, which eventually reunites Joseph with his brothers and his family, who then go down to Egypt to live with him. After some time there, Jacob is getting close to death, so he blesses his sons. We first see him bless Ephraim, Joseph's younger son, and passes on the Abrahamic covenant's land promise onto him. After the blessing of Joseph and Joseph's 2 sons, we then see Jacob blessing his 11 other sons. Reuben, Simeon, and Levi have all been rejected by their father Jacob for the blessing because of their past actions. So the blessing then goes on to the 4th born, Judah, and he receives the Abrahamic covenant's promise of rule. Jacob then dies, and Joseph's brothers are now scared that Joseph is now going to take vengeance upon them since their father is dead. But Joseph assures them that he will not, and that God's hand was working through it all. This book and this section end with the death of Joseph. So those are the 10 sections and the introduction that I would break up the book into. And I hope that you can see that through this is how the book naturally breaks itself up into these sections to point our eyes to the purpose of the book. Now, if I were to state that there was a theme verse for this book, I would probably go to 12:1-3 and 17:7, which say, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And 17:7, and I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your offspring after you. These two verses state two very important details about the Abrahamic covenant and about this book. One, that God made this covenant with Abraham and with Israel to be an everlasting covenant to be their God. And two, that through Abraham and through Israel, all the nations of the world will be blessed. Eventually, this points us to Christ, because he is the seed of Abraham, who brought salvation not just to Israel, but to the whole world, to people from all nations. And that's really the heart behind Genesis. God working his will to bring about salvation to all people because of the fall and sin as it's recorded in Genesis 3. Genesis is full of parallels, motifs, and prophecies about Christ. And it is a beautiful book. Now, I love this book, and I would love to teach an in-depth class on it. It really does show us God working through people and through all creation to bring about Jesus, as we see through the line from Adam to Abraham to Joseph and to Israel, to whom Jesus would eventually be born, who would die for the sins of the world. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. I definitely enjoyed making it and writing it. It did take a lot of work to make though. I'm excited for this series, and the next video on this series is going to be our overview of the book of Exodus, which will give you a little bit of foreshadowing. We have a different name for it than it does in the Hebrew or the original. So if you don't want to miss that, make sure that you are subscribed to the channel and that you have those notifications turned on. Give this video a like, and until next time, remember to know the word, do the word, and share the word. But as always, we do it in love.